is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to the 24 Hours of PAS preview. Today we're going to take a closer look at distributed availability groups today by Alan Hurt. I am your moderator, George Carlisle. If we can go on to the next slide. If you have any questions, feel free to use any of the support mechanisms in the screen sharing tool. Post your questions if you have any. Minimize, maximize your screen. We won't have any surveys in this, so we don't have to worry about that, any polls. Let's go on to the next one. We want to take a moment here and thank our sponsors, Microsoft, Idera, Attunity, HP Enterprise, and SQL. If you haven't joined PAS, now's a great time. There's lots of wonderful things you can get if you join. You can enjoy discounted event rates. You can enjoy access to online training and content. You can access to networking in local chapters and virtual chapters. Also, you get advance notice of membership exclusives. And the membership is free. Join now. PAS Summit's just right around the corner here. Until September 18th, you can get it for $21.95. Just make sure you use the discount code 24HOP200. Let me introduce Alan Hurt here. He is the managing partner and founder of SQL HA. He is a distinguished MVP in cloud and data center management and data platform. He currently is based in Boston, Massachusetts. He's currently wrapping up his latest book, Mission Critical SQL Server. And so now I turn it over to him. Alan Hurt, you have the floor.
Thanks, George. All right. Well, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are. As George mentioned, my name is Alan Hurt, and for about the next hour, I'm going to chat with you about distributed availability groups. And so some of you out there may be familiar with the regular availability groups. This is a brand new feature in SQL Server 2016, or shall we say a variant of availability groups. I'm actually going to be doing a pre-con, two things that you might be interested that are related to this session. So I'll be doing a pre-con at PAS Summit called Almost On, where I go through troubleshooting, and there will be hands-on labs, and part of that lab will actually be building a distributed availability group and working through issues. I'm working out the final stuff, but that's pretty much what I think the lab is going to be. And I also am doing a half-day session on all the new availability features in SQL Server 2016 as well as Windows Server 2016 for availability. So look out for that. Okay. So let's quickly talk about what availability groups are and what they are, at least through as we know them in SQL Server 2014. So an availability group provides database level protection. That means that if something sits outside the database, like, for example, an instance level login if you're using SQL Server authentication, which would have a mapping SID, back into the database, you have to manually handle that. SQL Server agent jobs, all that stuff, right? This is not a clustered instance of SQL Server, although there is an underlying Windows Server failover cluster underneath all of this. You don't need shared storage just like an FCI. You can use this with standalone instances of SQL Server, okay? Now, in SQL Server 2016, there is a way to do this without using Active Directory, and I'll talk about that more in my PAS Summit session. But let me just do a quick drawing here. So what we're used to right now is this. So let me, box this up. And let me change colors here. So what I'm drawing here basically is, so I've got, let's say, node 1 that has an instance, okay, of SQL Server. And then I've also got my second node of the cluster, which has another instance. In that instance, I will have a database. So let's change the color there. And now, and this box right here, this is our Windows Server failover cluster, okay? So in this case, we've got two standalone instances of SQL Server, so they're not clustered. And then what I can do is I basically create the availability group that spans this, and the AG takes care of the data synchronization between the two. And the data synchronization can be synchronous or asynchronous. But as it stands right now, through SQL Server 2014, all nodes participating in one availability group have to be part of the same Windows failover cluster. So if I wanted to stretch this over multiple data centers, all those nodes would have to be in the same Windows failover cluster, meaning both sides have to be in the same domain. Again, it's a much more, shall we say, complex thing for some people to pull off, especially if you can do like a DR type scenario. That's why there are a bunch of changes in Windows and SQL Server 2016 to make some of this easier. Okay. So what are some of the challenges? Well, one of them is one of the ones I just mentioned, is that your Active Directory on the other side. So let's say I wanted to set up an availability group that spanned multiple data centers, okay? So now let me get my little drawing tool here back. Be close enough for government work. So assume these are two data centers, okay? So this side's data center 1, this side's data center 2. So if I then have a node over here, data center 2, let's say this is my DR node. Again, this is all part of the same, this is all part of the same Windows Server failover cluster, meaning I've also got like AD over here, AD over here, and it's all part of the same domain. This can be challenging for some folks, right? Because sometimes when you're in another data center, you want to have completely separate things. Okay, so that's one challenge. Another challenge that we have in this scenario is that quorum, which I've done quite a bit on, it's a large section of my book. There's a past session that you can look at that I recorded a few years back on quorum. It's up on Past TV on YouTube. But basically, to maintain quorum in something like this, what happens, for example, if my interlink between the two sites isn't so reliable? Do I want my second site to potentially affect the availability of my primary site, right? So the general answer there, for the most part, is no. But right now, because it's very tightly coupled with a single Windows failover cluster, we have to do things like change votes. And again, that's a little bit outside the the purveyance of this session, but might change things like votes, a whole bunch of things to make sure that the availability of the second data center is going to affect the primary data center. So, and that also affects things like what type of witness we're going to choose. And again, there's one improvement in Windows Server 2016 called a cloud witness that might work for some folks, but still might not work for others. Another challenge we have right now is, let's say I've got a multi-terabyte database and I have that multi-data center setup. How do I actually seed, or how do I get that database to the other side in an availability group? Because that's going to take a long time. That's going to, choke up my WAN, or it may do other things like that. And another challenge that we have is, let's say you implemented SQL Server 2016 this summer on Windows Server 2012 R2. Next year, your company wants to move to Windows Server 2016. Well, right now, there's no real easy way, shall we say, little teaser for my session at Summit, to migrate just to a new OS, because I want to keep my availability group. I want to not really have a big problem on the SQL side because my SQL Server version isn't changing. I just want to upgrade to Windows Server 2016 and take advantage of what's in that. Well, right now that's a bit tougher than we would probably like, right? So enter distributed availability groups. Now, distributed availability groups were kind of kicked around. I believe Kevin Farley mentioned them at past Summit last year in his talk. They were not in any build of SQL Server 2016, either a TAP build or the CTPs. It was first introduced in the first release candidate, or RC0. So what is a distributed availability group? Simply put, it's an AG of AGs. It's an overarching availability group that spans multiple sub-availability groups. Now, the thing here is, right now, since this is SQL Server 2016 only, this obviously would only be a SQL Server 2016 thing, so this will not be backported or work with 2012 or 2014 configurations. But it will enable certain scenarios, and we'll talk about that, here in a second. And I'm going to draw this out for you, and then we'll do some demos. Underneath it all, some of the magic that's making this happening is the listener. So for those of you that are unfamiliar, the listener is a unique name along with an IP address that you create that then gets registered if you're using Active Directory back in Active Directory, as well as DNS, that is basically an alias for your underlying AGs. And the point of that is that your applications don't need to know which of the underlying servers is your, say, primary read-write copy, or if you're using it for read-only connections, which one that you're connected to. You just connect to that listener and it fronts everything. Now, you'll see in the drawing, but because we'll have multiple availability groups, you might be thinking, well, that means I can have 2 read-write copies if this is load balancing. No, there's still only 1 read-write copy of the database. So let's draw this out, a bit of what this looks like. All right. So, drum roll, please. So here will be one configuration, and here, because I'm out of room a little bit, but we'll do this. And my pen decides to be all wonky on me here. Okay. So what essentially we're going to have is this. So I'll have my, say, instance of SQL here, instance of SQL here, instance of SQL here, and instance of SQL here. And again, here I'm assuming the standalone configuration. I will then create an availability group, say, that spans here. Let's call this AG1. Screens are actually hard for good penmanship, believe it or not. We'll have a second AG over here. But then what we're going to have actually on top of that is an AG that spans this. So let's say this right here is my primary read-write copy, okay? So in this case, this would be its normal secondary replica. And for this AG, this will be its normal secondary replica. However, what's happening here is that this read-write copy is now synchronizing with this one, so let's call this primary, secondary, in their own little things. So while this shows up as a primary for AG2, the reality is it's, and Microsoft may get mad at me for saying this, but it's more like a distributor in the replication feature, where this pushes out the data to the other secondaries, right? So now you have to think of this sort of in this way. So you will only, again, have one read-write copy of the data. Now, I'll let this sink in for a second because this is a bit obtuse. But what we have here is two separate Windows failover clusters, two separate availability groups. But basically, you have a mechanism, which is a distributed availability group, which is now keeping these essentially in sync. So, why would you really want to use this, okay? So, the first thing is sort of obvious, and it's like an OS migration, right? So, we're thinking, again, I started out on Windows Server 2012 R2, and that's the nice thing about this is your AGs do not have to be on the same underlying OS platform. So this could be, for example, my Windows 2016. This could be my Windows 2012 R2. And this would work because it's SQL Server 2016 making all this magic happen. And you'll see, I'm going to be doing a demo of this in a second, okay? So that would be the migration of OS scenario. The other thing here would be your disaster recovery type scenario where, again, let's say this is two different, no, didn't want that, go away. It's two different data centers, so we'll call this data center 1 and data center 2. It takes away the complexity of maintaining a single Windows failover cluster that you have to worry about. Quorum, you can manage quorum individually in each data center, right? Now, obviously, if your Windows 20, in this case, your secondary AG goes down, it's not going to be synced, obviously. But you're not going to necessarily really affect the primary from a Windows clustering standpoint, which could be huge for some folks. Now, I will say this is an Enterprise Edition only feature. We do have availability groups in Standard now. I'll talk more about that in my talk at PASS Summit. But this is not something that will be used with Standard Edition. This is purely Enterprise Edition only. Okay. Now, a couple things that make this work better before we go into demo land. The aforementioned, we can create Windows failover clusters that don't need Active Directory. There's some caveats. And there's a brand new feature just for AGs, which, by the way, does work with the availability groups in Standard Edition, and it's called direct seeding. Simply put, you no longer have to take a full backup, copy it over to every single one of your secondary replicas, and restore it with no recovery. You basically tell SQL Server use seeding, and using the log transport, it will create the database and seed it. So it's a very handy little feature. Okay, let's go look at this thing now. So let me maximize this. Oops, didn't want to do that. Give me a second. It's the problem of Windows within Windows, quite sort of literally. All right. Now let me maximize this. Okay. So just to show you some of the basics from a Windows, because some of this is going to become important in understanding how availability groups work. Here are two separate Windows failover clusters. One called Journey with nodes of Shone and Perry. Another called Peanuts with nodes of Snoopy and Woodstock. Now, underneath that, I've got, each one has an availability group, and I'll show you these in SSMS as well, but, you know, I've got an AG, and this one has a listener of Escape, and this one has an AG with a listener name called Red Baron. Okay? None of this is exactly any different than what we know about availability groups today. Where it starts to get different is how this all looks, acts, and feels in SSMS. Okay? So, now if I look at, for example, Perry, okay? You notice I have here this availability group right here. That's your standard, availability group going on. Then I've got, let's look at Snoopy. Notice I have this distributed availability group thing, okay? Now, if I look at, hold on for a second. Something was flipped. There we go. Shown, do a refresh here. There it is. So this is my primary and my distributed availability group. It flipped for me at some point. Now, if you look here, I have primary and secondary replicas, but I can't see the databases, and I can't see anything about listeners. Whereas if I look at the standard stuff, everything is here, right? So mapping that back to what we see in the cluster, you have to understand that distributed availability groups are completely a SQL Server only concept. SQL Server is maintaining all this information in its own metadata. So if I look at, and connect to Shone here for a second. If I look at my sys availability groups, okay, so you'll see I have both of these. Now, if I go over, there is a brand new column called is distributed. So that is what tells SQL Server that this availability group is a distributed availability group. So you notice it goes with this AGHADR, and this right here, the thing that I configured, is the DR type of scenario that I drew earlier, where you want to have, two separate data centers, and you want to have an availability group, but you don't want to have it all be part of the same Windows Server failover cluster. You have different Windows Server failover clusters for it all. Now, if I connect to, now again, just going back to what I showed on Perry, if we look at always on, under the always on high availability and under my availability groups, note that it's a secondary for the AG for HA, meaning it's my local copy in my primary data center. So, but you notice it doesn't have the distributed availability group. However, if I look here, notice that it's got both of them, okay? So it knows it's part of the distributed availability group, even though it doesn't show. So again, SQL Server is maintaining it, and I only ever see the primaries, right? So now if I look at the ones in my other data center, if you will, so AG for DR is the name of the availability group that is the local one on the DR side, and Woodstock is the secondary replica for it. But in this case, Snoopy is also the primary, or sorry, the secondary, if you will, or the receiver of the information from the primary, which in this case is shown, okay? So if you notice here, it says synchronized. It's a bit misleading because that's for the local availability group, okay? I can't get to it. That's because it's a primary, but it's not really a live primary. It's only a primary in essentially name only. It's receiving transactions from the other availability group, right? Because I can go into shown up here, and I could go look at this and have no problems because it's the real read-write primary. So again, we have a completely SQL Server only concept here, all right? Now, just to show you how this all gets configured, I'm going to actually create a distributed availability group live. Gone through this a few times, so it should work just fine, but, you know, we'll see if we encounter any issues. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to create an availability group where this 24 hours of past database is going to become the new read-write primary. And I'm going to have it seed a different Windows failover cluster. Now, on that Windows failover cluster, I've got two standalone instances, Fripp and Blue. Now, let me just shell out here and show you what is running on those cluster nodes. Okay? So, let me just log in here. Nope, logged into the wrong one. As the police go by. All right, this is the right one. 5 or 6, doesn't matter. So these are running Windows Server 2016. Let me just go back to full screen here. So this is running Technical Preview 5. Just to show you that this really is, even though I'm logged in through SSMS on the other side. So let me log in locally. Just a standalone instance. And if I look at my failover cluster manager over here, I'm just showing you visually that this is a cluster. So I have two nodes, Blue and Fripp, and my Windows cluster name is KC80s. Okay? So I've got nothing running in it right now. It's just bare. It's just a Windows cluster with nothing at all. Okay? So let's go back to this one. So I'm going to create, because this is going to be essentially temporary, you may or may not want to do this in production, but again, just showing you what's possible. Excuse me. I'm going to create a single replica, not have a secondary replica for this particular AG. Now I'm calling this AGWSFC1 because just showing you that I'm going to create the availability group on the first Windows cluster. Okay, so that'll be executing right now. And I'm creating my listener as part of it. So once this is done, we'll go out to the Windows cluster and I'll show you that this is actually created. So if I go look at the roles, you'll see here, this is exactly what I just created. So I now have the Journey cluster with nodes of Perry and Schoen, and I now have a new AG with a listener called Frontiers. So again, we've been doing this in SQL Server 2012. This shouldn't be a big deal. Now, what I'm going to show you here, for example, is even though it's essentially a single thing, I'm actually inserting, so I have a job that runs every 10 seconds. So we'll see, yep, you saw the AG date go up to 20 seconds. We'll do it once more. So just showing you that inserts are still happening over here. Yep. Okay. So now I'm going to go create an availability group called AGWSFC2 on that second Windows Server failover cluster, which is that Windows Server 2016 one, okay? And it's going to get a listener of beat. And for those of you that don't get some of these references, that's okay. They're most of these are music. Just keeps it kind of interesting and fun. So now, if I go out and look at that Windows Server 2016, notice, okay, here's my AG. And that's exactly what I just created. So again, no fancy tricks here. All I did was create an availability group. But now let me point out, one of the key differences in the command that I issued, okay? Or a couple of differences, I should say. So when I created the availability group on the first Windows cluster, you notice it said for database, okay? But here, I just, for replica. I didn't specify a database. And then I have this new little phrase here called seeding mode. And seeding is that thing that I talked about where I don't have to do a backup, copy, and a restore. Okay? So I'll be talking more about that in my past Summit talk, but you'll see this come into action in a little bit. Now, what I'm going to do is enable join the blue instance to that AGWSFC2, and I'm going to basically say when things become available, use seeding. Give it the permissions. This is the special sauce here, basically, the other part of the special sauce to enable seeding in a normal availability group. Okay. Now I have to actually create the distributed availability group. And you do that on the primary, which is the read-write copy. So you notice there's this with distributed thing right here. And you notice here also that instead of endpoint URL, as part of the distributed availability group command, you're using the listener. So the listener is actually used as essentially your endpoints. And notice here that I'm not putting individual instances, I'm putting the AG names, okay? So let's create that. Then I'm going to go to, oh, frick. and create my other join it to the distributed availability group. Now, since I'm using seeding, I should be able to see its status. So let me go back to here. So if I go down to the bottom, because it should be the last one, it already succeeded. It says completed. Now if I also look at the seeding stats, this is what I just executed. Again, I'll go more into this, but basically showing you that seeding worked. Now if I go look at Fripp, I should see, there's my database, and it says synchronized because it's the primary for what's going on with Blue. Now again, you notice I have no databases here. If I do refresh, it seeded this one as well. So basically it piggybacked, okay? But let's say I want to go switch to my new Windows Server 2016 setup, okay? Now, looking at this, again, because it says synchronized, right? If I actually look at this query, and looking at the system DMVs, it says I'm synchronizing. That's because that's the state of the distributed availability group. So what I have to do, if I want to have a clean failover, is set the distributed availability group to synchronous to synchronize everything, right? Makes sense. So if I do this, then I go back and execute my query. Notice now it says synchronized, so I should be good. So I'm going to force a failover, a manual failover, which, by the way, is only how this is supported. You can't, and nor should you ever do automatic failover. I'm going to do that. And now what I'm going to basically do is clean up. So one little quirk about distributed availability groups is that you actually have to delete the availability group from both sides right now. It's kind of a feature, if you will. So I'm going to do it here. And because I no longer need this to be a primary, I'm also going to drop the AG, when this is done, on Perry that seeded my new Windows Server 2016. Give me a second here. So now if I switch over to Fripp, and then drop the distributed availability group there. If I now look at Fripp, let me just refresh this. Because remember before I couldn't essentially get it. Now it's just, bam. It's a normal availability group. So basically I did my flip over. Now the only caveat here, for example, would be you might need to recreate the exact listener that you used. But you see here that this is basically almost like a zero downtime for solution for flipping people over in an availability group. And remember that this right here is Windows Server 2016 underneath this, but it's all the same version of SQL Server. So essentially, I just performed an OS migration using a distributed availability group. Okay. So basically, this is what I showed you. There's this new is distributed. You create the individual AGs, create the distributed availability group, and you basically join the other AG to the distributed AG. So what are some of the things that you need to worry about? Well, first of all, as I mentioned, it's Enterprise Edition only, and this is purely maintained by SQL Server. There is no concept of this in the Windows Server failover cluster like there is with a standard availability group. So you need to be doing things like querying. Now the other part too, which is there that I didn't mention, is that this is also T-SQL only, meaning the PowerShell commandlets as well as the GUI do not support this. Now if I go back to my demo here, you'll notice, for example, actually I destroyed it. That was dumb of me. Let me recreate it real quick. So let me do this. This is why I have cleanup scripts. Okay. Actually, no, I can show you on Shown. Sorry. So on this, when I have the distributed AG, I can see things here, but I can't, for example, like if I right-click on this, I can't delete it. I have no options. I'm hoping to talk to the SSMS folks for when they just show a distributed availability group. That's, you basically can't see some of this stuff because really, as you see, I can't do anything in the GUI. You notice I did a bunch of that stuff here, like to just delete the availability group as a standard drop availability group, but it's T-SQL only. So if you're not comfortable with T-SQL, you shouldn't be using distributed availability groups. That's just a given at this point, but maybe at some point they'll put it in the GUI, but right now it is T-SQL only. You can't create a listener for the distributed availability group. It is literally just basically a way to bridge two or more availability groups underneath. So you can't have the concept of a listener of listeners. The one thing that you will have to worry about, and let me draw this for you, is latency. So sure, you could set everything to synchronous everywhere. So let me draw my two. Let me draw my two Windows Server failover clusters. And I will draw my two nodes in each. And I will draw my instances in each. Doo-doo-doo. Okay, so when we create a regular availability group, let me choose a color. Like this one has to keep this one in sync, and this one has to keep this one in sync. So let's say we set this to synchronous, okay, for your data synchronization stuff. Then for your distributed availability group, this has to keep this one in sync, and then in turn, obviously, this keeps that in sync. So if I set this to sync, right, you now essentially have to wait for it to be completed over here, over here. It has to basically be hardened in the T-log to come back over here, and it's got to be here. So if I have some latency between here, and let's say this is two different data centers, okay? If I have some latency, and I have latency here, this could be a bit of a nightmare. So really what you want, to be honest with you, if you wanted to, oh, why is this eraser not working? Ah, that's better. So if you really wanted to, I would set this to asynchronous. Now I set this to synchronous, you could also set this to asynchronous. But this will allow you to not worry essentially about latency in the essentially the primary to primary scenario, right? But it is a big concern here, right? And it's one of the reasons that we don't want, for example, automatic failover, right? And it makes sense in this case because you're looking at some sort of either configuration switch or DR type scenario, which you would generally never want that to begin with. And we could take that discussion in in a whole different thing, again, outside the purveyance of what I'm going to be talking about today. But you do have to worry about this latency, so you have to know your networks to really understand what's going on and set things right if you're going to do distributed availability groups. As with a standard AG, your entire drive configuration has to be the same. Again, no surprises here. Typical AG stuff, but I wanted to point out that this isn't going to solve that issue for you. So if your databases are on drive E and your logs are on drive F, well, you're going to have E and F everywhere. And that would be true whether or not these are all standalones. You're mixing clustered instances in with this, because this is supported, by the way, with FCIs as your instances, or standalone, or you can mix them. So you can have FCI plus AG in the same configuration. So basically what we're looking at here is extending the functionality of availability groups. Now, in a way, this simplifies your Windows clustering story underneath if you want to have DR, but in some ways it is a more complex setup that not everybody should do. Right? You have to really think about how this is all going to work. What does it look like on my network? Are we going to have latency? How many replicas are going to be total of this? Because if I'm going to have 2 and 2, you know, again, that thing that I just drew, I don't want to have synchronous everywhere. So, and I do know folks who don't use listeners because of what that entails, meaning there are some objects that go back in Active Directory and DNS. So if you don't use listeners, you cannot use distributed availability groups. And with that, I will open up the floor to questions because I know I threw a lot of stuff out at you. And I covered a lot of ground in less than an hour. But there is a lot of stuff here with distributed availability groups. So with that, let's take some questions.
Okay, so let's see here. If you have any questions, please post them into the Q&A.
Oh, come on, somebody has to have a question. And just to show you, while we have a couple of minutes here, my setup for distributed availability groups, looking at, so I'm running, this is my my new sort of lab box, but I've got all of my nodes here. Nodes 3 and 4, by the way, which was that Snoopy and Woodstock. Remember I talked about how it was DR? Well, if I just do a quick thing here, notice that this is on a 201 network, okay? Now, if I go and look at that first node, which was Perry, okay, and I just do a quick IP config here, you'll notice this is on a 200 network. So I'm simulating multiple subnets. So this truly was not just I had 4 nodes I was calling DR. These are 2 different subnets, which is a pretty typical configuration for DR. You know, where one site has different networking than the other, we have networking that lets it talk to each other. So I really did set up both scenarios, both the one I demoed where I created the distributed availability group, as well as the DR scenario here, right? So just going back to my list of VMs here, I've got my redundant domain controllers, and here's my router. So it really is pretty much what you would see in a real world. Now, obviously, most people's routers are hardware, but, you know, it's a little bit harder running this here at home. Okay.
Okay, Alan. So we have some questions here.
Great.
These have come through all through the hour here. I'm going to go through here and read some of them. At
Yep.
1:13, we had a question from Harold Velasquez. Did I understand correctly? There are two read-write. Oh, okay, you answered that question.
Well, let me just clarify. So
Okay,
just
okay.
going back to my picture here, I did answer it, but it bears repeating. So here's my primary. So this would be primary, secondary, okay? This is my read-write copy is over here. While this is a primary, it really isn't a read-write copy. It's just receiving the stuff from here. So it is a primary from a pure normal availability group standpoint, but it's not read-write that I can access this as a normal availability group. Like, it's not load balancing, so I can't come in with an application over here and do a write. That's not going to happen. All my writes have to go over here. Okay. Hopefully that clarifies it a bit more for you, Harold. Next question.
Harold has another question here. Will the distributed AG expand across different clusters?
Well, again, I talked about that. This is literally separate Windows clusters. So this is WSFC1. And if we go back to my demo real quick, just doing what I did that last time, I'm not going to reconfigure that distributed availability group. But when I showed you that this was a Windows Server 2016 thing, and then I showed you that I created the availability group and the distributed availability group. So yes, you have multiple Windows clusters involved in this configuration. That's actually kind of the whole point, is that you're not locked into a single Windows Server failover cluster.
Hernan Sharazola has another question. Will this work if the versions of SQL are different on each cluster? Does it need to be SQL 2016 in both?
Yes. So right now, as I mentioned earlier, this is not something that's getting backported to other versions. So right now, this would be a SQL 2016 to SQL 2016 type of thing. However, what we don't know is, for example, in the future, if we get a vNext, whatever that may be it 2018, 2019, if we could use this for migrations, my guess is that, yes, we will probably be able to do that. I have no advanced knowledge. But for now, like, I couldn't do a 2012 or 2014 to 2016. Right now it's 2016 to 2016. But I would hope that in the future we could do 2016 to vNext. So we'll see. We just got 2016, so we've got plenty of time to see what Microsoft's going to do. Any other questions?
Yeah. There are lots of questions here. I'm just going through them and just trying to sort them out. So,
Sure.
Michelle David asked a question. Why don't you use automatic failover? This is what will happen in a DR event.
Okay, so real short, because we don't have a lot of time, and standard spiel, you never want to do automatic failover in DR, regardless of whether it's AGs, FCIs, database mirroring, because the reality is you're not just getting SQL Server up, there are other bits of infrastructure. So SQL Server is part of the chain, and when you make the decision to switch data centers, that is a decision that's made by upper management. There's lots of, basically, we have a smoking hole in the ground at Site A. We want to switch to Site B. That's a lot of work. It's not just flipping SQL Server. So if automatic failover basically is generally not an option in almost every DR scenario, so just don't do it.
All right, some other questions here. Ronaldo Kimball, he asked a question, can the distributed AG be in different AD domains? If so, what
Yes.
permissions are needed?
Again, because I only have an hour, I'll talk about the more past summit, but basically, if you're using Windows Server 2016, that some of that might be possible because you can have domain lists. And with actually SQL Server 20, actually I take that back. With SQL Server 2016, you can create AGs that use certificates, but you do need Windows Server 2016. So as long as Windows Server 2016 is part of this, somewhere in this mix, what you're talking about may be possible. But if you're sticking to current versions of Windows, the answer is no. We probably have time for one or two more questions before we have to flip through the slides and switch to our next presentation at the top of the hour. So hopefully I'll be able to get a list of the questions and I can answer some of them offline.
Yeah, I'll be happy to get those to you.
Thanks.
Keen Lim asked the question, if you have AG1 and AG2, in which case AG2 is purely DR inactive, does it need a license for AG2?
I'll defer to Microsoft on that. Chances are you probably will of some sort. It all depends on number of replicas, but again, I will defer to Microsoft and their documentation on that. Work through Microsoft licensing experts.
Teo Ali asked the question, is there a way to make the second AG primary read-write?
No. The only way to do it is to basically do what I did, which is flip over to it and make it the primary. Like I said, this isn't having two read-write copies. Now you could have another database that's a read-write database, but it wouldn't be a database participating in the distributed availability group. So the instance itself could house an AAG that's read-write, just not the one that's participating in the distributed availability group. So we'll take one more and then we'll flip through the last couple slides real quick.
That sounds good. All right, so Kai Gerlach has a question. As it is SQL internal, only how do you compare this to doing it with log shipping? Do you understand that question? Does that make sense?
If we had time, I'd ask them to clarify, but unfortunately we don't.
Okay,
So I'm really sorry if I didn't get to your questions. Stick around for Dimitri talking about the ambiguous case of off-row storage and in-memory OLTP. Thanks for spending this hour with me, and I hope you enjoy the rest of 24 hours of PASS.